Blackouts are reported across Ukraine and Russia as both sides dig in and attack each other's energy infrastructure. Why now? And what is Putin's reaction to getting a taste of his own medicine? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. I always say that firearms should be your last line of protection. Knowledge, training, and preparation are the real investments that keep you safe before you ever pull a trigger. That's why I've teamed up with today's sponsor, the USCCA. They've got over 800,000 members, everyday Americans who've decided they're not going to be victims. USCCA membership gives you the tools to be mentally, physically, and legally prepared. Members get access to the Protector Academy, a secure online training platform packed with expert-led digital guides, ebooks, checklists, and more. They also offer video-based bite-sized training. It makes it easy to get real-world skills that you can use immediately, from dry fire drills to AR-15 instruction. Plus, membership comes with a host of other perks, like gear discounts, 24/7 emergency legal helpline, and the concealed carry print magazine. And every USCCA member receives insurance on a self-defense liability policy purchased by USCCA. If you're ever forced to defend yourself, the aftermath can be expensive, even if you're justified. The USCCA helps protect your freedom, because one bad day could ruin your life if you're not prepared for what comes next. Don't wait for a wake-up call. Download the free Conceal Carry and Family Defense Guide at the link in the description. Okay, so Ukraine has been targeting Russian energy, leaving thousands of Russians without power. And this is interesting for a couple of reasons. One, this is part of a larger Ukrainian effort to target Russian energy infrastructure, particularly in border regions. Even as folks like Lavrov report, they are ready to hold talks with the U.S. But remember, the U.S. isn't a belligerent in this conflict. It's Ukraine who Russia needs to make a deal with. And this, I think, is really interesting because what we are seeing more and more is not just Ukraine targeting Russian infrastructure, but actually Ukrainian strikes are also hitting power in a lot of major in a lot of major Ukrainian cities. So again, Ukrainian strikes disrupting heating in major Russian cities. And that, I think, is a hint to the real strategy here, right? The major Russian cities, again, are in Vorozhne and let's see, at least one other in Belgorod, right? So two border regions that are within range of Ukrainian, more Ukrainian heavy weapons, right? In order to take out a power facility, you need more explosive power, literally a larger warhead, than current Ukrainian drones can typically go after. That's why those drones, those long-range drones, are focused primarily on oil and gas infrastructure, because oil and gas infrastructure is pretty flammable. Now, here's the thing, though. Russia has also blacked out a lot of Ukrainian power, right? So, let's see. Ukrainian power plants are reportedly down, at least as of 2 days ago, as part of a coordinated strike by Russia. And this is what I thought was interesting. Typically what we've seen, and this has happened almost every winter, that Russia has targeted Ukrainian energy infrastructure. These are the things that provide power and, more importantly, heating to large swaths of Ukraine's civilian population. Now, all thermal power plants operated by Ukraine's state-owned energy company are down following a large Russian attack targeting every single one of them, right? And now, the company said these thermal power plants had been restored after attacks last year, and then they were hit again, targeting them each minute overnight on November 8th. Ukraine downed reportedly something like, it looks like about 80% of those drones, but still 60 drones passing through is sufficient to deal a lot of damage when you're talking about less than 10 total power plants, right? It said 3 thermal power plants, essentially all the company's assets in 3 different oblasts. But what I thought was most troubling was, again, not so much that this is happening, because even last year in Ukraine, almost every building, almost every house had their own backup generator that they would turn on because these were seen as such typical attacks by Russian forces. The troubling part is twofold. First is the level of coordination, the fact that the Russians can launch enough of these drones at these specific targets at the exact same time, and the fact that Ukraine knows these are sensitive targets. And Russia still has the volume to overwhelm air defenses. And you can see here, this is a chart of all Russian strikes on Ukrainian targets inside the country, you can see here that as of Trump's inauguration, Russia went from 150 to 200 a day, with now larger peaks. You can see that the median number of strikes remains low, but peaks are really large, particularly around, as they point out, large geopolitical events, with up to 1,000 strikes hitting, or nearly 1,000 strikes hitting Ukraine on any given night. So again, you look at the month of September, and you can see that while the typical night has only about 100 airstrikes, you see that the largest, I'm going to say 3 days, all exceeded 400 strikes. This means that Russia has figured out that overwhelming Ukraine's air defenses relies on volume, and that it's actually better to save your strikes instead of throwing them every day. It's better to launch them all at once and actually overwhelm air defenses. This means that, though, that they can, once the air defenses are overwhelmed, Russia can target specific areas and instances, including hitting 3 critical infrastructure points all on the same night and disabling all of them. So that, I think, is the troubling trend. But the at least upside is that Ukraine is finally pivoting to targeting Russia in the same way. Now, I want to be clear. Targeting civilian infrastructure is a war crime, right? Whether Ukraine or Russia does it. However, for 3 years, Ukraine has refrained actually from targeting Russian infrastructure. And this is difficult because there is, for the Russian public, a core part of Putin's strategy is insulating them from the war. The war is something distant happening over there. It's one of the reasons why the U.S. public stomached the war in Afghanistan, despite the fact that it was 20 years long and we lost, was because to the average American, the war in Afghanistan was happening over there. Americans didn't experience tax increases. They didn't experience a draft or mobilization. In fact, the average American didn't even know anyone who served in Afghanistan. So the whole idea that there is this that Russia just could get away from the hard part of the war is central to Putin's political strategy. And as we've talked about on this channel a lot, when you have this level of mismatch between a large country and a small country, that large country is able to sustain the fight and win using a North Vietnam type of strategy, which is to say, avoiding high stakes battles on the battlefield where the more resources of the larger opponent thrive, and instead focus on increasing the political cost of continuing the war. That's how the Afghans won in the Soviet War. That's how the North Vietnamese won in Vietnam. And that's core to Ukraine's current strategy of maintaining a high level of punishment for Russians. The problem is, of course, the Russians have the other side of the equation. Also, this is also part of their strategy, right? Terrorizing the average Ukrainian. And what the Russians want to do, part of the reason you're seeing this increase in strikes is because the Russians are, if nothing else, very thin-skinned, right? Despite spending years targeting Ukrainian energy infrastructure, when Russian energy infrastructure is targeted, the Russians become irate. And we've heard this not just in terms of their willingness to target Ukrainian power plants, but also reportedly, Russian drones are now targeting food aid going to Kherson and other frontline towns. Reportedly, they're targeting journalists at a scale they've never have before. They're targeting civilian vehicles. All of this is because Russia feels offended that their civilians are being targeted. But remember, Vladimir Putin is not a thin-skinned, petty guy. He's willing to take short-term humiliation if it is in his long-term benefit. The fact that he is responding this strongly means that this is a genuine sore spot, a genuine political issue for the Russian state. And we've talked about how many other ways there are more and more cracks emerging in this sort of Russian consensus, where Putin, his oligarchs, the upper class in the Kremlin of bureaucrats that are really pushing this war, increasingly, there is a lot of shakiness there, particularly in the Russian propaganda space, particularly for the average Russian who is now facing not a thriving economy that was sort of running a sugar high for almost 2 years. The Russian economy was actually running very hot as government spending drove the economy. Well, now that government spending is falling off, and so we're seeing a Russian economy that is really in bad shape, probably going to enter recession this year. You're combine that with the fact that the average Russian is now at risk of losing power in urban areas like Moscow or Belgorod. And then you add on to that the a million plus casualties from the war. And what you have is a recipe for Russians who are saying, guys, you told me this was a 72-hour special military operation. We're now into year 4. When are we going to get that stunning victory? Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Thank you to Alfred Chesky, Alan Knutson, Christine Schumann, Deborah Oppenheimer, and all of our Lieutenant tier members. We'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.